All right, Harley, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Carson. How are you?
Good, good. Okay, so let's just get right into it. How vegan are you?
On a scale of totally to not at all,
Yeah,
about
uh,
one step away from not at all.
about one step away. What puts you one step away?
I still eat vegetables.
I like it.
very grudgingly, I have to say, but um, I will never give up cauliflower cheese. So I don't think I'm
Oh,
quite gonna go all the way, but
cauliflower cheese. Okay, is this something you get at the store or something you make yourself?
a little bit of both, and do either way. It's a
Okay.
pain to make on your own. So
Do you not eat dairy at all?
yeah, I, I, I guess I eat cheese and drink milk, obviously.
Gotcha. Well, I wasn't sure. So if you eat a cheese that's made out of cauliflower, or did you mean cauliflower that has cheese on it?
Yeah, so do you not have it in America?
Cauliflower
Is this
cheese?
like a cultural? Is this like a cultural divide?
Yeah, it must be.
No, cauliflower cheese. It's basically just cauliflower, like boiled cauliflower in cheese sauce.
Oh,
I'll send
okay.
you a recipe. It's
Okay, yeah,
very
sounds
nice.
good.
It's the
We
staple. It's like you have with you have like when you have a roast dinner, you'll have a Yorkshire pudding, you'll have some roast potatoes, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower cheese. It's like a
Okay, yeah, we don't have
little
Yorkshire
very
or
nice.
anything, but I'll go for that too. But
Heathens.
yeah, we actually us vegan people sometimes make cheese out of cauliflower, so that's what I thought you were talking about.
Oh,
Um
okay.
yeah. Okay. So so I think let's see. I kind of want to take it more of a ethical philosophical route versus the diet itself, because a lot of people view veganism just as you don't eat animal products, and I think it's way more than that. And I think nobody can be fully vegan, and hopefully nobody is the complete opposite. So I kind of view, like, if I had a scale of 1 to 100, 100 might be the person that actually would not kill a chicken on an island to survive. I mean, that's crazy. If somebody has that in their head, that's fine. But that mindset is not what led us to survive over the years, as far as evolution goes, and same with other animals. So I would say somebody that there probably aren't many at all would be somewhere in there, where I put myself somewhere between like an 80 and a 90, and I made up the scale and I'm making it up as I talk right now. Um, but as far as trying to cause the littlest amount of suffering as possible for what's needed, where I would say if you were a one, you would have to be so lacking empathy that you are totally fine with like beating a dog with a baseball bat. So then there's this like scale going on. So I'm guessing that you are not in favor of beating a dog with a baseball bat.
No, no.
Okay, cool. Okay, so let's look at fur for a second. I think fur is a good route to start with. What are your thoughts on fur considering our advancements? I know, like, if somebody is in some tribal area, they don't have a civilized society, it's a whole different story. But when you're as advanced as we are and you have all these different fabrics for making various different clothing, coats, jackets, you have all the blankets we have, anything you would need materials for warmth or clothing, we have so many. Do you think it's reasonable to to take fur from animals that we aren't using in other situations? Like some people will eat rabbits and maybe use their fur, but something like a mink farm where you have all these mink and they're just in a farm and you kill them for their fur and that's all it's for. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I can't say that I've thought terribly about it because I'm not rich enough to afford fur. But in principle, I don't really have any kind of necessary objection to that. I mean, to obviously, I don't know all the details concerning how the fur is collected and everything like that. I know it's obviously been a contentious thing for many years, but the principle essentially is, I mean, if we can kill cows and chickens and pigs and everything for food, um, I don't really see a distinction between that and say having a deer farm for deer hide or or a mink
Mhm.
farm or anything like that to collect the skins either. I wouldn't have an objection to that.
Okay. So is there no level where the treat the treatment matters, or are you saying the treatment does matter, but the outcome doesn't matter?
Yeah, I don't think the outcome matters. I mean, my kind of general position is essentially that the animals in whatever form they might take can be used to satisfy particular needs or desires that we have. So if we do desire, say, coats made from animals, and we desire the meat from cattle or whatever else it might be, that to me is not something that I consider morally objectionable.
Hmm.
The treatment of animals is a different matter. Obviously, there are ethical ways to, or you might say more ethical ways to, for example, slaughter animals for food or take their fur for clothes. And so we can have a discussion maybe about the extent to which animals should be protected um, and spared certain unnecessary tortures. However, the idea that we could do those things to achieve those aims, I have no objection to that.
Okay. Okay, well let's hop off of fur for a second and just look at like a cow. So okay, so we're saying we can use a cow for its leather and milk and its meat for eating. So similar to the not beating a dog, would you say that you don't think somebody that runs a farm of cows should beat cows? Like you shouldn't just randomly punch a cow in the face for fun.
Yeah, I think that would be considered unreasonable behavior.
Okay. So because I like the idea of breaking this stuff down, and because a lot of times we don't think about what our limits are and why they are. So maybe this will be interesting for you to maybe you'll come out of this going, oh, I've never thought of this before. I have no intentions to turn you into a vegan or anything, but I
this
just think
isn't
it's
this isn't like a ploy by Big Vegetable, is it?
yes, I
To
control them
convert.
all. But yeah, so I guess I would say, does there have to be a certain level of outcome to get from it? So the meat, you're saying the meat is a worthy outcome, and it sounds like you're saying maybe the fur is a worthy outcome. Um, is there anything that's not a worthy outcome for the
um,
killing?
it depends what you mean in a tangible sense. I mean, so for example, I haven't got an objection necessarily to hunting either. So you could say, well, is that an outcome, the thrill of the hunt kind of thing? I wouldn't
Mhm.
have a problem with that. And I don't think that in terms of a tangible byproduct, there's necessarily any limit that I would put either. So, for example, I mean, we use cows for multiple different things, as you mentioned, leather and food and milk and everything like that. But one of the uses that we have in this country, at least, is our banknotes are made of a kind of plastic
Mhm.
um, kind of material, and the bonding agent in that, I can't quite remember the name of it, but the bonding agent from that is from a cow is derived from a cow and then is used in the notes. And so
Hmm.
let's just say, for hypothetical sake, that was the only thing that we could take from cows, that they weren't edible and that their skin wasn't good for leather or anything like that, and that was the only thing that we had. My position is that we could still farm them for that if we wanted to.
Okay, so just to get anything out of it. Or not just
Essentially,
anything,
yeah.
but that okay. Including the thrill. So the hunt, even if it was just for the thrill and like mounting the head on a wall, they're not going to eat it. They just leave the body to rot out in nature. The thrill is enough as well.
I would say so. I mean, there are people who are not, psychopaths who
Hmm.
do enjoy the thrill of the hunt, who enjoy hunting big game, who do it as a recreational activity, do it as a family activity, for example, take their kids out. It's something that teaches them discipline and all this. And these aren't reasons necessarily for it. I'm just saying that there are good and legitimate reasons why people would want to do that, even if there isn't necessarily a tangible physical outcome to
Mm-hmm.
that. Now, I suppose the challenge to my position would be, so where does that stop? Because you obviously mentioned a
Mm-hmm.
few moments ago, if you were just punching a cow in the face, what is the tangible outcome from that? Or what is the intangible outcome from that? You could throw my argument back in my face and say, well, I just want to. It just makes me feel good.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably I'm okay with certain limits on the mistreatment of animals for the sake of it, in the sense of causing pointless harm, I suppose you might call it. One of
Mm-hmm.
the reasons for that is I think that there's a clear kind of psychological difference between the desire to hunt and to eat and to use furs than is displayed by people who are the type who do abuse animals. I think there's generally some kind of deep psychological issue going on there,
Mm-hmm.
um, and so that's something that we should look at. I think in terms of the treatment of animals.
Okay. I mean, should the psychological element affect it? Like if somebody, let's say that has a normal brain, let's just say that me and you both will call it normal, is going to shoot for the thrill of the hunt, and they shoot, they kill, they're excited, they get this adrenaline, they like it. And then somebody else that we, let's say we both call an abnormal brain, they have some mental issues, and they will punch a cow in the face, and they get a bunch of joy from it. Let's say it brings them the same amount of adrenaline and joy. Is the fact that we view their brain as different, does that affect it if they both are getting the same amount of joy? Or is the difference that maybe the deer died quicker, so there's not the suffering there?
Well, I think I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. Essentially, we have to consider whether the proposition that someone, quote unquote, normal would engage in the more wanton abusive treatment of animals, whether a normal person would do that. Something I had drinks with a friend a few weeks ago. Something they put to me was that we were talking about this subject, actually, ironically, and he was saying, what is the mental difference between, say, a human and an animal? And the kind of argument that I put forward was that humans have the ability to go against their own natural instincts for self-preservation. And a point that he made, and that we're still working out, is I made the claim that human beings can, if they so choose, kill themselves in sound mind. So if so that I can go against my own will to survive purely by my mental ability to do so. And his argument was that he didn't think that was possible, because a healthy mind wouldn't be motivated to do that thing, even to prove a point. So
Mm-hmm.
um, the question is, people who commit suicide aren't in sound mind,
Mm-hmm.
and we can then infer from that anyone who would commit suicide isn't in sound mind. I think and that someone who was in sound mind wouldn't do it. And so I think we can probably make a similar case for animal abuse, which is that someone who can kill an animal for food, and or just for the thrill of the hunt, that's not necessarily something that indicates some kind of mental problem.
Mm-hmm.
However, someone who abuses animals, in almost every case, I mean, people who have cats and dogs and abuse them in their homes, or people who are found to be doing that kind of thing,
Mm-hmm.
almost always have something seriously wrong with them. And
Yeah.
so I suppose we could make the contention that this category of, well, someone normal could do this and would want to do this, is not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily something that I would say exists. So I think it only
Mm.
does apply to people who have um, psychological issues.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I'm trying to figure out the why we would allow it in one case but not another. Where if we're okay with, say, a certain amount of suffering, like as far as like using an electric rod to make a cow go into a certain area for its execution, and various different amounts of suffering that might exist there. if we accept that for somebody that's of sound mind, I guess I don't see the reason to not accept it for if they're not of sound mind. Now I get the difference. I get that if they're not of sound mind, that is something that we can explain what that means. But if somebody's in like a mental hospital because they can't be among the rest of us, I still am perfectly fine with them getting TV if TV shows make them feel happy. So if it's an equal amount of torture, but let's say they don't even like the taste of meat, but they really love torturing animals, if they get this amount of pleasure from it that somebody gets from maybe eating some food, I don't see how the sound mind should affect if we make it all right or not. I think maybe we should make it all right based on the outcome or the amount of suffering.
Yeah, it's not really that the nature of the mind committing the action matters. It's that we can reasonably deduce from observation that the minds that do this aren't sound, and therefore,
Mm.
and that's just one reason why we could consider certain actions um, like the torture of animals to be something that needs to be looked at legally. Whether that's something that we need to put in place is obviously a connected but separate issue, and obviously right and wrong, the morality of that. But fundamentally, I think that there is a kind of a consideration there about the psychological motivation for certain actions and how we can reasonably assume that those actions um, in themselves demonstrate themselves to be what's the word, the sort of evidence of mental impairment or motivated by mental impairment or otherwise um, the result of something which is not, which we wouldn't consider to be fair use, I suppose, of an animal.
Mm. Okay. Okay. Well, let's go a different route then, because I'm guessing that if we had to cause a certain amount of suffering to get, say, a product of food that one might consider necessary for our health, like let's say that like humans needed to eat beef, that we would allow maybe more suffering to get that than something we didn't need. So I guess what I'm wondering is if we don't want to let something be tortured just for the pleasure of the torture, what if it's they're being tortured to get a product that we can consume that let's say we can know is not healthy for us. Um, like let's take something like cake. Like you make a cake with like eggs and milk, and let's say that we can look at those eggs and that milk was caused like a wild amount of suffering, and the only outcome, I mean, it's all right if the person wants to harm themselves by eating unhealthy food, that's their own choice, the unhealthy element of it. But if they aren't getting anything beneficial, and let's say we could figure out a way to agree on this, that they weren't getting anything beneficial, does is it all right to make them suffer to get the pleasure of the taste, even if you don't need that?
Yeah, I think that, see, this is the difference between kind of the legal and I suppose ethical, which is that that people's free conscience should allow them to make that decision on their own. Should I tend to be quite reluctant to permit laws to be put in place in general, in a
Yeah,
general
let's just go
sense,
ethical
certainly
for this one.
in regards to in regards to personal preference. I think I would lean on personal preference, and so it obviously depends. It's entirely contextual as to what I would do in what circumstances, whether I think that it's justified to um, induce a certain amount of harm in animals in order to procure the things that we want or need. Obviously, there are different contexts, but um, everyone basically should have their own compass and their own direction as it pertains to, say, purchasing decisions. For example, people
Hmm.
obviously can choose to take cosmetics which are not tested on animals. But my personal view is that cosmetics which are tested on animals should still be sold, and I don't, again, necessarily have a fundamental objection to us using animals in that way. Um,
Well, what about just for
and that's my
yourself?
personal preference.
What about for yourself and maybe for your loved ones? Like for example, you might be okay with almost anything involving animals, but if you're, let's say somebody close to you, let's say you have a brother and you're really close to this person, and they have a dog and they beat their dog. And let's say there's no way to get them in trouble for it, but you just know they beat their dog and they won't stop. Is that enough of something where you would say, maybe you don't want a law in place, but you have to distance yourself as far as morally that's too much for somebody to stay close with?
Yeah, well, I mean, I personally would, and I think most people would. In fact, most people do
Mm-hmm.
have a certain degree of empathy for animals. And in fact, I think even yourself as a vegan probably has varying levels of empathy. I mean, for example,
Mm-hmm.
if you're, let's say it was your brother who was torturing his dog, you would obviously have profound objections to that. But if your, brother kept a fly swat next
Mm-hmm.
to him at all times and whack, 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 I don't think you would have as much as moral objection. I doubt you would stop
Yeah.
talking to your brother because he started killing flies.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a kind of balance here that most people make anyway, including vegans. And so
Mm-hmm.
for me personally, I find it distasteful to extremely distasteful, in fact, to conceive of a person doing that sort of thing. I would have incredible suspicions about people in my personal circle who were doing that. I would probably justifiably think there was something wrong with them. If there
Mm-hmm.
were no laws in place to deal with them, then it would be on me to implement my values in my own life and distance myself from those people.
Yeah.
Um, I guess it just depends on each person's tolerance for that. So for example, if I had a brother who was a cattle farmer and killed cows for beef, I wouldn't have a fundamental objection to that. But if he just kept a cow in the back garden just to poke it with a cattle prod every now and again, I think that would be a
Mm-hmm.
different consideration. But I would be reluctant to impose laws upon this situation because I don't necessarily think um, that animals have rights, and so it's not something that I would necessarily want to see implemented. However, I could perfectly well understand, as we discussed before, about should we have fair use and what isn't considered fair use. I'd be perfectly willing to compromise to some extent in
Mm-hmm.
regards to, say, torture, for example. I think in a civilized and sane society, I think kind of collectivizing that general, almost unanimous empathy towards animals would be fine, but I would place a limit uh, quite, quite, quite a long way into
Yeah.
that to allow humans to use animals as the natural components for whatever it is that we're looking to produce.
For sure, for sure. Which is why I think it might be best to just go with personal ethics. I'm very curious to see where your personal ethics go versus what the law should be. Um, so I think part of the problem is we base a lot of what we do on norms. So similar to both of us would distance ourselves from close people if they beat dogs. And even though I might compare certain treatment of animals for certain types of food to that, I'm not going to end a relationship with somebody close to me, even if I think it's just as bad, because it's not as normal to do so. Like we're all accepting of distancing ourselves from the few wackadoodles that beat dogs. Um, where if somebody like so in the dairy industry, I'm sure you know a handful of these things, but because of needing dairy, we have to impregnate the cows. So they, for various different reasons, they don't have the bulls do it. So somebody has to put their entire arm inside a cow, fertilize their eggs, and then the cow gives birth. but we want the milk for ourselves, so we take the calf away, and that's where veal comes from, at least if it's a boy cow. And it's actually pretty devastating. One of the most devastating things, the reason why I think it's sadder, or I think it's more of an issue to drink milk than it is to eat meat, because there's a lot less suffering with the meat element, where with the dairy element there seems to be a lot more suffering going on. I don't know how long there are attachments, similar to dogs. I think dogs take a couple months before the mom starts not having attachments to the babies. But when they pull the baby calves away, the moms start crying out. It's a really sad process. And then if the moms aren't tied up, they'll start chasing after the calf as they take it away. Anyways, they take it away. They kill the calf for veal. But to make veal taste a certain way, they actually have to starve the baby calf for maybe 3 weeks and then kill it. And then with the milk situation, I don't know how much better it is to just regularly milk a cow with human hands, but I can imagine, considering that cows, like most mammals, they feel pain. If you attach a metal contraption to its udders to pump out the milk, they're not there's nothing that tells the machine that this cow's like udder is like has a sore spot, or it's like this is very painful, so it keeps doing what it does. So I think in these practices, in these factory farming practices, especially if we were all under the impression that we don't need dairy, I think the science is pretty clear on that, but I don't want to make any claims of science and like what we need or don't need. But I would say that if somebody felt good about having this like nice farm with free roaming animals, and somebody milks the cow and the cow's not running away, and um, they have small batch milk that they sell, or I don't know, um, I, then I feel way different about it. But the idea of putting these animals through this wild torture of a form of like a rape type situation, pulling a baby away, putting a machine up to udders, this process just seems so torturous, for things that it can be used for. So I guess I just feel like, at best case scenario, if we said that our bodies need milk for, obviously we don't, because it's a different animal. No animals in the wild drink milk from other animals. But let's say we even did. Let's say we each needed a cup of milk. So we each drink a cup of milk every day. But aside from that, I feel like any added dairy to anything would just be us getting that pleasure of taste and being willing to make something suffer, like for like adding like cream to coffee, or oh, you guys add cream to your teas, wackadoodles. Isn't that you guys that do that?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
um but
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 I've heard
anyway,
that Americans make cups of tea and coffee in the microwave anyway. I don't know how true that is, but
I saw that I
is
saw
that
that
true?
BBC news thing. No, I mean there's probably some, but I don't think it's
Mm.
common. I personally do a cold brew myself. um but yeah, I think in India they do it how you guys do with the cream in the tea, and it's like thought of as this thing where if you had tea without cream in it, like it's like blasphemy, and it's this wild thing. But anyways, so what are your thoughts on like this level of suffering with cows, like with the idea of what I described, and if for your personal ethics, like how much you would like would you feel better if you like say we're gonna eat like a certain amount of dairy a day, but then if you cut that in half, therefore cutting that demand in half, you would be attributing half the amount to the suffering? Like, what does that kind of thing make you feel?
Yeah, well, it's a difficult equation to make because once you've kind of conceded that it's wrong to I wouldn't say treat the animals in this way, but that it's wrong to inflict a certain degree of suffering on an animal in order, maybe because it's the only way to obtain a particular product. Once you've conceded that, you have to go all the way, because you can't just go, well, I'll only do it on Tuesdays. It's like I'll only torture the cow on Tuesdays. So once you concede that, it's a slippery slope all the way down. And so I'm not necessarily willing to concede that that's always wrong or unjustified. Like I said, I think that human beings and the way that we are as creatures, something we mentioned in our last in the debate we did, not me and you, to Eric, was about how human beings produce. We don't consume necessarily from the environment. We actually take the components of the environment and put them together, and so that's how we are. That's how we survive, and so that's how I see the use of animals. Um,
Mhm.
as a
Well,
general rule, is
how
that
about just you though?
now
Like like you eating the thing, like not just how humans are, but like when you stop and think about your personal actions, what do you think about it?
I've never really had that much of an issue with it. I think there are certain things that I see that kind of get everyone. For example, there are things like um, I saw a conveyor belt once where they were taking newborn baby chicks, and the conveyor belt would push them into a grinder. And at
Mm-hmm.
first glance of that, and I still don't actually know what the purpose of that was, but at first glance, that seems like a horrible thing to do. Um,
Mm-hmm.
though I would probably have far greater levels of empathy if it was, say, human babies, for example.
Yeah.
Um, so there are obviously things which at first glance, for any kind of right thinking person, uh, uh, at first glance appears to be distasteful at the very least. But I haven't personally seen anything within the pro within the processes that produce the things that I use that I would consider to be wrong, from a from a kind of moral perspective, um, if it's in service to producing the goods that we need or want. And that might not necessarily be a very popular way of phrasing it, but I think
Mm-hmm.
that most people do actually take that view, which is ultimately, even I think most people are aware of of some of the practices that go on, for example, with dairy farming. I think most people are aware of that kind of thing, and yet ultimately, I think that they see it as something which is justified within our nature. And so, yeah,
Gotcha.
I think I draw a firm line, I would say, in terms of what's necessary to produce the things we need. If it's at the expense of a human being,
Mm.
no. But if it's at the expense of animal and lower, then I personally haven't found any personal ethical reason not to engage in that ultimately. To take just one example, for example, I don't really have an objection. From what I know, I don't personally have an objection to using battery farmed eggs, for example. If I'm in the shop and there's free range or battery farm,
Mm-hmm.
I'll just pick whatever comes to hand. It's not something that I personally think of when I made that decision. Um, so so that's my compass essentially. There may be something in the future where you might say to me, your I don't know, your Diet Coke is made by whatever,
Mm-hmm.
to that it needs to have this animal byproduct and it needs to be done in a certain way. In that case, I may say that doesn't, that doesn't sound too right to me. There must be some other way to do that. And if there isn't, I'd just think, well, maybe that's not for me then. But so
Mm-hmm.
far, there hasn't really been a consideration towards, the animals that we farm, um, that have stopped me engaging with most of the things that we use in day to day.
Mm-hmm. Just quickly explain why the conveyor belt chicken thing happens. So basically, in the egg industry, they hatch the chicks to find the female chicks to lay the next set of eggs, and so the male chicks are the ones that go in the conveyor belt and get ground up. just because
Mm.
there's no use for the male chicks. For whatever, I don't know if we just don't at all use roosters for chicken, like for meat. I don't know if there's a different taste or whatever, but it is kind of interesting that there's essentially in all the industries involving chickens, there's just no use for the males, so they or at least for many. So that's what happens there. I would even say on in some kind of strange way, even though it's it almost seems more torturous to watch the quick grinding up of the chicks, I would guess cause less suffering than maybe the day-to-day machine milking cows. That's kind of a fascinating element to me, is to break down each element of how this stuff works. Like a lot of people put a lot of hate towards hunters, almost more so it seems than any other approach to getting meat. But I feel like when you're hunting, a deer is spending its whole life in out in nature, and not that I approve of killing it, but just killing it really quickly. It's amazing compared to animals being forced to not be out in nature, and they're like a billion animals crowded into one spot, and then the suffering that goes there. So I like to break
Yeah, so I
down the
think, well,
different
I just
elements.
to kind of yeah, to I mean to break down on that and to talk about the differences, because you've actually, in the same way that I've expressed a tolerance within a range, I think you've expressed also a tolerance within a range, which is so
Mhm.
take for example, you obviously have probably a deep moral objection to the removal of male chicks, and obviously
Mhm.
because of the numbers involved, they're killed because we can't have that many. Like
Mhm.
they're unsustainable numbers, I would imagine.
Mhm.
So if it were possible, let's say through the CRISPR technology, for example, that we could now, and probably we will probably be able to within the next 10 to 20 years, but if we could select select the sex of the chickens that were hatching so that every chicken that came out was exactly what we wanted it to be, and therefore the
Mhm.
conveyor belt that killed them was no longer necessary, would you be more inclined to um, say eat eggs or eat chicken if and other factors involved, let's say it was free range and everything like this, would you be more inclined to eat that, or would you view that as less as more favorable as a practice and less morally dubious?
Yeah, I don't think I'd be more inclined. I mean, I guess more inclined to eat it than in other situations. But yes, I think if we could, if right now we have a million chicks exist and half are males, and we kill them, and we can just not have that half that are males exist, and we just have the half a million that are females. Yeah, definitely might as well go that approach. Yeah, anything that causes less suffering, I would say is best, because that's kind of my mindset, is you can't prevent all suffering. It's a main thing that's talked about is the animals that die in like crop production, moles and snakes and mice and various things, and like the pesticides will kill off even like hummingbirds and stuff like that. So it's pretty devastating. I care way more about myself than anyone else, and I care more about people that are close to me than anyone besides that, and I care more about humans than other animals, and then so on and so forth. I care more about mammals than insects. Um, but I will chop down a tree to build a house for myself, and I won't care how many animals are living in that tree. Like I'm choosing myself over everything else. But once I'm fine and thriving and surviving, I have shelter, I have warmth, we have this abundance. I'm not going to use fur for a blanket, even if I like it a bit better than I like whatever kind of blanket there is. And I've been vegan for 8 years, and I feel fine. I feel good. I mean, I don't eat the healthiest. I should probably actually eat healthier and not eat the garbage processed stuff. Um, but I feel fine, and so my idea is that I don't want to cause any suffering I don't need to. But there will be suffering here and there. A lot of things lead to it. We just have to decide how much we're up for, which is kind of why I liked the idea of the challenge for you with the dairy stuff. And I wanted to take it a little further. So let's say that we weren't able to just get stuff at the store, and you just walk, instead of driving or walking down to the store, you drive or walk down to the farm, and then you just see this dairy cow with this machine hooked up to it, and it's pumping out the milk. And let's imagine we don't need to have it go through a process of getting the milk ready for you. Let's just say we drink the milk fresh straight out of the cow. Like if you witness the cow like suffering, and you could see that maybe like one of its udders is bleeding or something, and let's say you don't have to worry about if that makes it into your milk. Let's say your milk, no matter what, is going to come out just how you like it, but you witness the suffering. Do you think, like, would, if you were there with your tea getting ready to purchase the milk that just got pumped out of the cow, but you're witnessing the suffering, would would it affect you? Would it make you maybe do it less if you did it like 3 times a day, you'd do it once or something?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting challenge. I personally think I would, and I think there are plenty of, for example, farmers who are not vegan,
Mhm.
who do this on an industrial scale, who do the milk production and do the slaughter of the animals, and the battery farms and all that sort of stuff. And many of them, I've heard testimonies of them who say, I don't like it in there, but still eat the products that come out of there. And so everyone has their own tolerances. I would personally probably be able to do that. Um, it is a good kind of litmus test as to whether someone is truly okay with it. Would you be willing to do yourself? It's something that comes up in the um, in the abortion debate. Is I can't quite remember off the top of my head now the argument, but it's essentially goes that um, essentially, if you when someone who is in favor of abortion says to you, if you don't support abortion, you must be willing to adopt the babies that come out. To which I would reply, if you do support abortion, you must be willing to do one, actually do
Mm.
one, and take the baby out yourself, and then tell me whether you would be happy to allow this process to continue. And I
Mhm.
think it's quite a good litmus test of someone's personal beliefs. Would they be willing to do the things that was necessary to produce those products that we talked about? And I
Yeah.
personally, my personal view is I probably would be. I think probably I'd be a bit squeamish about, say, removing the pelt from a rabbit. But I think
Mhm.
ultimately I wouldn't have any moral quandaries with that. If I had to, say, kill a cow in the production line, I don't know how they do it. I think it's is it the bolt in the head or something like that.
Yeah,
I think
usually.
ultimately I would probably be able to do that with a clean conscience.
Mhm.
But that's just me, and that's my own tolerance to this sort of thing. Maybe there would be certain practices that I would find distasteful and would prefer to do other things. So, for example, in the UK, we have a um, arguments on the regular, because we've got quite a large Muslim population, about allowing halal meat. Um,
Mhm.
if you know much about halal meat, it's the process of essentially severing the jugular or something like that on
Mhm.
a I don't know the full details of it. It's essentially allowing the animal to bleed out rather than instantly killing it. And we have laws in place in this country to stun it. Maybe there are
Yeah,
certain
okay.
practices that I wouldn't necessarily want to witness, but I think in general I would be able to do so ultimately if I had to get the things that I want and need. Um, and I include want in there because I think that um, as humans we have the right and the desire in us to acquire things that we think will satisfy our values. And so I include want in there because I think it's perfectly justified if a human being wants, say, a fur coat,
Mm.
that they ought to be able to acquire that.
Okay. Well, I guess since we should probably wrap it up here in a second, I guess I will end it on circling back to the beginning. And let's say the person that wants to torture a dog. They have a pet dog. They like to just torture it, but keep it alive. Let's say that you test whatever you need to test, and it turns out that they're fine in all areas of life. They go to work, they have a family, they treat everything perfectly fine. Maybe you can even look into the future and you can see that they're not going to be serial killers. They're perfectly fine, but they just get this really good want out of torturing this dog. They hang it upside down by its feet, and they take a tiny knife and they put some cuts into it. They punch it a bunch. They basically maybe make it suffer as much as possible in a day, every day, for the rest of its life. And let's say it lives another 10 years. um where do the wants end? And it's okay, we all have different wants, kind of like I was talking about, like I'd take this over this or this over this. For you personally, if you were going to make maybe the law step in, and you can also point out, well, you've already told me your personal morals, but maybe for the law to step in, what amount of abuse with somebody being of sound mind as well? Maybe you don't think those combine, but maybe for a second, let's just say they can. They're of sound mind enough for you. What amount of abuse can happen before you think the law should step in?
So it's a very difficult question. Where do you draw the line? I mean, to what? How do you measure suffering? I suppose is a question here. Like you correctly identified, I don't think necessarily someone who'd do that would be in sound mind. Like I said before, I think that if we are to regulate, like I err on the side of not regulating as a general rule,
Mm-hmm.
because I believe that human beings should, to the extent that we can be allowed to exercise our own rational judgment. Now, I suppose the kind of compromise that I would make on that um, is in relation to the action itself. So, for example, there's a reason why we restrict people from being able to drive at a certain age. It's because the nature of the activity itself precludes certain people or assumes things which are necessary to participate in that thing. And I think in the same way with something like animal torture for the sake of torture, as I said before, I think that we can quite clearly demonstrate through psychological study that the people who engage in the action of animal torture of the type that you're describing
Mm-hmm.
are motivated by clear psychological problems. And so the nature of the activity itself is something which is antithetical to functioning human action, I suppose. And so
Mm-hmm.
I would be okay with um, with cracking down on that, or at least be willing to compromise on cracking down on that, because for that reason. Um, and so I think that essentially that would be my argument, is that it's the nature of the activity. It's not necessarily whether a single person can demonstrate that they're sane enough. There are certain actions that we restrict, prohibit, on the basis that it's not right. Um,
Mm-hmm. Well, okay,
for us, and I think.
let me throw in a little, sorry to cut you off, but let me throw in another
Oh,
little
that's
bit
fine.
of an idea then. Because I really want to figure out the difference of the pleasure here. So, okay, so let's say the only way to get dairy from, well, first of all, let's say hypothetically that we just know dairy is unneeded. So with what I'm about to say, let's just say if dairy is unneeded, but you, Harley, you like dairy the amount you do. So let's say it's unneeded. Let's say the only way to get dairy from a cow isn't by milking it. You do exactly what I described with the dogs. So somebody that wants to get, let's say you have a cow in your house, and this might seem disturbing because nobody does it, but let's say this is normal. Anybody can have cows in their house for this reason. So similar to the dog, you hang it upside down. You torture it a whole bunch. You have to stab it. I don't know why it would take torturing to torturing to this kind of level to get milk, but let's say it does. Uh, so there's various different levels of beating the shit out of this cow the same way you'd beat the shit out of a dog. They're both hanging upside down. One person, we have this idea of seeing that aside from this, they're perfectly fine and not going to do anything. And same thing with this cow one, they're perfectly fine and not going to do anything else. One person gets pleasure from just doing the beating itself. The other person is fine with doing the beating, and they get pleasure from the milk, that the milk comes out after the beating. And so in both cases, they get equal amount of pleasure. And they're in both cases, nobody's consuming anything they need to consume for, let's call, like, our natural health or anything. Um, walk me through again real quick the difference here. Obviously, this is different. Beating a dog almost to death, but keeping it alive to make it suffer is not what we're doing when we milk cows. But just if we do put these like kind of side by side, hanging upside down cows, torturing them from their milk, do you see a difference with this random weird hypothetical?
I do to some extent. And so to go back to the point about you sort of saying, why would it be necessary to do this to obtain the outcome? And I think that is actually a key point to make before we start, is that in many cases it's actually not necessary to do the most distasteful things that you can to obtain these things. And often, as technology develops, we find new and better ways of doing these things that reduce the
Mm,
amount of suffering. And I think that that's a good thing. Obviously, we want to mitigate suffering as much as we possibly can. Um, However, like I've said, I don't necessarily believe that the animals necessarily have a right not to expect it. Um, Not to expect it, but that's not the right words. That they have a right which they can assert to prevent it. I don't believe that. Um, Lost my train of thought when I used the wrong words there. But essentially, so the point I was making was that we get better at doing these things over time, wasn't it? And so that um, it's not necessary to do these things. We can do them within a reasonable limit. I suppose then going on from there, the difference is a kind of personal ethical one, which is that if you believe that the outcome itself justifies it, and for me that is it something that a human being needs or maybe desires, then
mhm,
that's something that I think can be justified. It's something that ethically people can refrain from if they find the practices to be too far. And like I've said, there is a difference between the psychological um, assumptions underlying particular actions, and the you can't, I think, make a psychological assumption that people who want to obtain from animals something which is, say, necessary or desired from a tangible sense,
mhm,
that is in the same category as the motivation to commit an act purely for fun. And
mhm.
so they're different categories. Legally, it's something, as I said before, I'm willing to compromise, but it's a difficult situation. To take an example, for you probably know more about it than me, but the way that I think, I'm not sure in the UK, I think it, foie gras, I think it's pronounced,
Yeah,
is banned
the
because of the way that it's produced. I think they have to kind of force feed a goose or something like that.
mhm,
So that would be a little bit more closer to the hypothetical that you're talking about, and it's been banned in this country. Um,
hmm.
I personally disagree with that. I think that if people want to, I mean, it sounds disgusting, whatever it is, but if people want to eat this thing, and if the method of obtaining it is that, I personally don't necessarily have a problem with that.
Mhm.
Um, but then we'd say, well, and your argument or question would be, well, what if someone just wanted to force feed a goose for the hell of it, just to see it like stuffed up and choking and all the rest of it?
Mhm.
And my response would be the response I've given a few times
Yeah.
before, which is,
Well, I
what
guess
kind of
that
person would do that? And then the action, the
w-
embedded
I
in the
think
action, implicit in the action, is a concern for the psychological state of the person who's doing it. And on those grounds, we could say, if you're just doing this in your own home, maybe the law
mhm.
has a place to step in. I
Yeah,
wouldn't commit to it necessarily, but I could see the point.
yeah. Well, so laws aside, I guess just focusing on the morals for a second, I think that is kind of the idea where different people have their levels of empathy and different levels for empathy for humans versus for animals for various different things. I'm weird. If I see a worm on the street, I have to pick it up and put it on dirt. Yeah, I don't think people need to do that necessarily. I don't know if the science is in on if they feel any pain, if it matters, but it's just kind of a go-to for me. Yeah, anyways. But yeah, the idea of what kind of a person would torture this animal for fun, or for pleasure. I guess that's kind of the idea that a lot of people, or at least myself, get. Now, I'm not saying this about you because I think people that don't know much about the suffering and they're just doing what they've grown up doing their whole lives, and you're raised a certain way, you do a thing. So I don't think like what kind of monster would do this, because obviously anybody would do it, everybody does it. But I think the idea of, if we knew something was not good for us, if we knew we didn't need milk or something, and there's an amount of suffering that goes into getting the milk, and we take it just for the pleasure, like I don't really, the only reason I'd rather that person babysit my kid than the person that hangs the dog upside down and tortures them is because looking at the norms of it. But if you know that there is this wild amount of suffering just for the pleasure of the taste, I guess what you're thinking about, what it seems like you're trying to tell me about how we should view the mental state of the other person. I would say the same thing of, once you know a certain level of torture, if you knew there was a level, if you could be shown to a pretty far extent of the torture of the duck doing the foie gras thing, and you knew that somebody was doing that just for that taste, but let's say that there was no healthy aspect to it, that we just knew it wasn't healthy, but as a person's personal want to eat this thing, and it tastes better when it suffers for whatever weird neck thing, I would say that if you're doing it just for the pleasure, you're doing what the other person's doing. You're just doing almost a stranger thing. Like we'd call cannibalism kind of disturbing. Like I would, like, not in a survival situation, but somebody that just wants to eat somebody's flesh. But somebody could like sacrifice themselves and say, I'm going to kill myself so you can eat me. But we'll probably view that as this like disturbing idea, and they're consuming a thing. So I don't think the idea of consuming it affects the pleasure we're getting for not we're not getting anything other than personal pleasure, pleasure of taste, pleasure of just endorphins in the mind. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I repeat the argument I made, which is the sort of person that would want to do that, the kind of Jeffrey Dahmer type
mhm.
thing, not exactly in sound mind. And
But
so,
how
but
is the other person in
obviously
sound mind?
cannibal. Well, sorry, which other person?
The Because I was saying that I don't see any difference between, like, if you go to a place and you watch this cow get tortured, and after a bunch of torture you're watching, milk drips into a thing, and then you can go and add it to your coffee. Oh, how is that not a Jeffrey Dahmer? And I'm not sorry. I know that obviously would sound like I'm calling you a Jeffrey Dahmer because you drink it,
No, that's
and
fine.
I don't think it to that level. But if you saw this torturing happen, and the suffering, you witness the suffering, and the outcome is a pleasure of taste. So let's remove it. Let's say we both agree that beef is healthy for you. That is what it is, and that's going to make Harley and Carson strong, and we need that to survive, and that's a selfish but good want. But I'm talking about something where you don't need it. It's just a pleasure of taste. Let's call it not healthy or unhealthy. The only thing is pleasure of taste. If the suffering happens, like, to me, that seems like a Jeffrey Dahmer type thing, as well as the dog thing.
Hmm. Well, so there's a couple of points. I've wrote a point just here because I don't speak about this often, so the things that I say won't necessarily come out as articulately or coherently as I would like. So the first thing is I would draw a distinction between a human being and a non-human being, or at least I would draw a
Mhm.
distinction between a creature which is rational and a creature which is not.
Mhm.
I think that the difference between human beings is consciously, intellectually, the nature of our consciousness is volitional, and the range of capability that we have from everything to emotion and upwards is an entirely different category, and is something that for me it's not merely a matter of subjective empathy. It's essentially a completely different mode of being.
Mhm.
And so for me, I don't see um, animals in the same way, and I don't respect, so to speak, the
Mhm.
rights of animals. I don't believe that they have rights. I don't believe that they are of an order of beings which are similar to us. Um, you know, functionally, I think that they are part of the environment which we as humans need to act on to
Mhm.
produce the goods that we need to produce. So I see them maybe in a different kind of conceptual way than you do.
Mhm.
Um, but to go on to a kind of second point, which I wrote down, and it's as I say, not as coherent as it could be. But I think the kind of argument that we're having, well, not argument, more of a friendly conversation
Mhm.
that we're having here is that is essentially just a disagreement over our tolerance of suffering, or a tolerance of,
Mhm.
let's call it, abuse you might use. I mean, you mentioned earlier in the conversation that you understand that many animals die as a result of crop farming, and that you see that as something which unfortunately is necessary, but it's
Mhm.
the lesser of two evils, and therefore you're more okay with that than you would be with the thing, and you eat the products from that crop farming because you see it as less harmful. But one of my headphones. But essentially, what you are essentially saying, there we go. Sorry about that. What you're essentially saying is that you just have a higher, you have a lower tolerance for suffering than I do.
Mhm.
Um, and maybe that's built on different principles. Maybe that's built on different values, different conceptual frameworks, different kind of hierarchical rankings of different beings, and that's fine. But that, to me personally, is kind of a subjective thing. It's your
Mhm.
subjective preference. I just accept a higher level, or I have a higher tolerance for what humans do to animals to obtain the things we need. And so
Mhm.
I don't necessarily think you and I are necessarily even um, disagreeing principally. I think you just maybe have a much lower tolerance for the kinds of things that humans can do. I have a tolerance personally, which
Mhm.
extends up to, say, um, torture for torture's sake, for example.
Yeah.
That's my line. You obviously share that line with me, but you would go much further than I would. I would say maybe, I'm happy to include the slaughter of cattle in order to get steaks. You're not, but at
Yeah.
some point you'll go. So I'm okay with animals being accidentally churned up um, by the harvester to get wheat for bread, and so are you. And so
Mhm.
we're there together again. And it's just, we just have different lines, and we both
For sure.
also probably do agree that uh, personally that we would prefer the methods by which we obtain these things to be less less torturous. So for
Yeah.
example, if there were two methods by which um, dairy uh, could be extracted, let's say one was metal and one was rubber, and they were
Mhm.
both as effective as each other, then maybe I would make a consideration to use the rubber one, which might be a little bit more soft um, and 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 less painful and more receptive to the animal's needs.
Yeah.
And that's the line that I draw, but it's just a subjective line. You
Mhm.
might say, well, let's say with the harvester, um, if I don't know, if the harvester, I don't know, sprayed something ahead of itself, which startled the animals and made them run away out of the, kind of
Mhm.
like a street sweeper, but the opposite of a street sweeper. So street sweeper kind of grabs it in, but the
Yeah.
harvester kind of pushes it out. And therefore, when the blades turn, everything that can have been pushed out more or less will have, and there's a lower impact. Then you would say, great. And I would probably say, great.
Yeah.
However, it's just a subjective level of of tolerance to what we do and how we impact. So I don't necessarily think that there is a kind of massive difference between our positions. I just think you have your views, I have mine, and we kind of use the same justification, just at very different levels. That it appears we kind of don't have the same view, but we essentially do. I'm just
Yeah.
more of a heartless bastard than you. So
Yeah, no, exactly. But no, no, I agree with you. And part of it is we have what's in us. Like you having that thought and me having my thought, like I'm not better for being born with this thought, and you're not better for being born with your thought. We have the thoughts within us. You can't make, like, if you had somebody that was not like either of us and was completely psychopathic and lacking empathy, they're born that way too. I mean, we can't have them living amongst us. So we, have to put them in jail or whatever. But out in nature, they just exist, and they're going to do what they do, and we do what we do. So there's nothing really there. Like I don't think you're a worse person than me or anything. Now I think we all do have room to figure out, grow, learn things. There are many political and philosophical ideas that I have that I've felt differently on in the past. And so maybe I will change more on this topic, and maybe you will change more on this topic. But yeah, for me, when it really just comes down to the idea of suffering or not. And I initially went vegan about 17 years ago. I was vegan for like a year and a half, but then like I missed different meats so bad that I went back to eating meat. And then for a while I was vegetarian, but whenever I'd get eggs, I'd do like the free range, and then at some point I cut out eggs. And so we all do different things we can do to mitigate the suffering of animals. I think we as a society should do better to prevent more suffering, like deer getting hit in the road. I think we should have ways where we can block deer from even being able to go to those areas. They have their nature, and we leave them to it. And we just figure out better ways, like you're talking about with the harvesting. I think there are some sound machines that are created that make certain, like, mice and different things, that sound will make them scurry and run away. And I think we need to get better at that. I wish every house had a kind of a sound thing built into its foundation to make rodents and insects just stay away from a house completely. Because I'm I am not against people exterminating their mice and ants and stuff in their house, because we need to survive. We need to make sure our foundations aren't being destroyed. We need to make sure ants aren't getting in our food. And it's life. So yeah, it's complicated. But anyways, I was glad you took the time to break this down with me. I'm glad to hear your thoughts on it. And yeah, any last thoughts or anything you want to throw out there?
no, I don't think so. It's always a pleasure. I was expecting to be completely dominated with your vegan knowledge, but fortunately you've been kind to me. So yeah, but I think we've had a good discussion. I think we've kind of come to more or less a conclusion that we essentially agree on the basics, and I have sympathy for your level of your lower level of tolerance for these things. But
Mhm.
yeah, personally, I'm comfortable with the level of tolerance that I've got for the
Yeah.
things that we do, and
Well, well, well,
yeah.
one thing that you had mentioned earlier that I think most people should do, and maybe even vegans should do on other topics, would be, if you're going to consume it, to experience what it's like. I don't know how many farms will let you in to see what things are like, but a big part of it is the separation of even ever being around the animals. Like maybe if you hung out with a cow and just were standing there and petting it or something, you'd be like, oh damn, I can never do this again. Or you'd go like, okay, I see these conditions and I feel good. So every little bit, you know how like we have our intuition makes us think something immediately. If we have an opinion on something and we hear a counter and it sounds good, we usually tell ourselves we got to figure out a way to make that wrong instead of like being perfectly rational. Luckily, I think me and you are pretty rational people, and we like to be and figure things out. But yeah, anyways, I think that's a good. I wish I don't wish I wasn't vegan, but I kind of wish I could experience the idea of not being vegan, but thinking about these topics and going to a farm and seeing if the lives of these animals affect my thought process on it. So anyways, I guess what I'm saying is if I can ever convince you to go to a farm and hang out with some animals, I'm curious to hear your thoughts after witnessing what it's like. But yeah. Anyways, I don't know what I'm rambling about anymore, but
No,
yes,
that's fine.
it was good talking.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. As always.
All right. Well, you have a good one. Talk to you next time.
You too. See you in a bit.